In 2023, the global weight loss industry crossed $250 billion. And if you asked most people why all of that exists, they'd give you a pretty simple answer. Obesity. People got fat, so people started dieting. What nobody stopped to think about is that dieting is older than obesity by about 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks were restricting calories in the 4th century BCE. The Romans were purging between dinner courses for political reasons. Medieval monks were starving themselves to death and being celebrated as saints for doing it. Dieting was never a response to a health crisis. It was something else entirely. And that story is a lot stranger than any nutrition label. If you'd asked a citizen of Athens around 380 BCE what the word dieta meant, they wouldn't have talked about cutting carbs. They wouldn't have mentioned belly fat or beach season. They would have described an entire philosophy of living. Dieta, the Greek word that eventually became diet, referred to a complete system of daily habits. What you ate, yes, but also how you slept, how much you exercised, how often you bathed, and even how frequently you had sex. Hippocrates, the physician whose name still gets attached to the oath doctors take today, was one of the first people in recorded history to prescribe specific food restrictions for specific body types. He wrote extensively about the dangers of eating too much or too little, and he categorized people by their constitution. If you were naturally moist and soft, Hippocrates had a meal plan for you. If you were dry and firm, he had a different one. The goal was never to look a certain way. It was to keep the body's 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, in balance. I mean, think about that for a second. The very first dietary advice in Western history had nothing to do with appearance. It was about balancing fluids that don't actually exist. But Athens wasn't the only place where food restrictions served a purpose beyond hunger. 300 miles south in the rocky hills of Laconia, the Spartans turned eating into a political act. Every male citizen was required to eat at a communal mess hall called a syssitia. The meals were deliberately plain, nothing luxurious or indulgent, and the portions were intentionally small. This wasn't about health. It was about control. A Spartan who couldn't handle a restricted diet was considered unfit to fight. And a Spartan who was unfit to fight was, functionally, not a citizen at all. If you failed to contribute your share of food to the communal table, you lost your citizenship rights. Eating too much or eating the wrong things was essentially treason. The connection between food restriction and moral worth didn't start with Instagram fitness culture. It started with soldiers in bronze armor deciding that hunger meant discipline and discipline meant power. And then there was Rome. The Roman relationship with food is one of the most misunderstood chapters in ancient history, partly because of a single word that most people get wrong: vomitorium. The popular image is a room where wealthy Romans would excuse themselves mid-feast, vomit, and return to eat more. It's become shorthand for Roman excess and self-induced purging as a lifestyle. The reality is slightly different. A vomitorium was actually an architectural term for the passageways that allowed crowds to exit amphitheaters and stadiums quickly. The word comes from the Latin vomere, meaning to spew forth, referring to the building spewing out people, not people spewing out dinner. That said, the Romans absolutely did practice deliberate purging. The Emperor Claudius was documented using a feather to induce vomiting after meals. Seneca, one of Rome's most respected philosophers, wrote disapprovingly about dinner guests who ate to vomit and vomited to eat. The practice wasn't universal, but it was common enough among the wealthy and politically connected that multiple Roman writers complained about it. And here's what makes it interesting. The Romans who purged weren't doing it because they thought they were overweight. Obesity as a medical concept didn't exist yet. They were doing it because a Roman senator who appeared lean and disciplined projected authority. A fat senator signaled self-indulgence, and self-indulgence signaled weakness. In the marble corridors of the Roman Senate, your body was a political statement. So you had the Greeks treating food as medicine, the Spartans treating food as a loyalty test, and the Romans treating food as a power play. Three ancient civilizations. Three completely different reasons for restricting what people ate, and not a single one of them was about obesity. But what connected all three was a physician named Galen, working in Rome during the 2nd century. Galen took Hippocrates' theory of the four humors and turned it into a sprawling medical system that dictated which foods were hot or cold, wet or dry, and how each one affected the body's balance. His dietary prescriptions were detailed, specific, and confidently wrong about almost everything. Galen's framework was building towards something that would trap Western thinking about food and the body for over 1,000 years. But in the 2nd century, it was just a doctor telling people to avoid cucumbers if they had too much phlegm. What nobody understood yet was that Galen's system was about to collide with something far more restrictive than Greek philosophy or Roman politics. It was about to meet the medieval church. And the church wasn't interested in balancing humors, it was interested in saving souls. And the fastest path to salvation, according to the men who ran the church, went straight through an empty stomach. Here's the irony. The same Greek and Roman medical texts that were written to keep athletes competitive and senators looking sharp ended up in the hands of Christian monks. And those monks didn't care about athletic performance or political image. They took Galen's dietary frameworks, stripped out everything about balance and health, and replaced it with a single idea. The flesh is the enemy of the soul, and hunger is how you fight it. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the early church fathers had turned fasting into the cornerstone of spiritual discipline. Augustine of Hippo wrote about the constant war between the spirit and the body's appetites. John Cassian, one of the founders of Western monasticism, listed gluttony as the first of the 8 deadly thoughts, the list that would eventually become the 7 deadly sins. Not lust, not greed. Gluttony. The desire to eat was, according to Cassian, the gateway sin. If you couldn't conquer your stomach, you couldn't conquer anything else. And the monks took that seriously. Desert fathers living in the Egyptian wilderness during the 3rd and 4th centuries competed with each other over who could eat the least. Some survived on a single meal a day. Others ate every other day. A few claimed to eat only once a week. The historian Palladius documented monks who ate nothing but raw herbs and drank only enough water to stay alive, for years at a time. These weren't people trying to lose weight. They were trying to kill every physical desire their body produced, starting with the most basic one. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to most people today. As the centuries progressed, this extreme fasting moved from the desert into mainstream Christian culture. And it didn't just stay within monastery walls. The church began dictating fasting rules for everyone. By the medieval period, roughly 1/3 of the calendar year was designated as fasting days. Lent alone covered 40 days. But there were also Ember Days, Rogation Days, the eves of major feast days, and every single Friday of the year. On these days, Christians were forbidden from eating meat, and in many periods, also eggs, dairy, and animal fat. Think about that. For roughly 120 to 150 days per year, the church told an entire continent what it could and could not eat. This wasn't a suggestion. In many regions, breaking fast days was a punishable offense. Courts levied fines. Repeat offenders could face public penance. The medieval diet wasn't something you chose. It was something imposed on you by men who claimed to speak for God. And then there were the saints. Catherine of Siena is one of the most celebrated figures in Catholic history. She was canonized, declared a doctor of the church, and named one of the patron saints of Italy and of Europe. She was also, by any modern medical standard, starving herself to death. Catherine began restricting her eating as a teenager in the 1300s. By her early 20s, she reportedly survived on nothing but communion wafers and water. She told her followers that ordinary food made her physically ill, that her body rejected anything except the Eucharist. Her confessor and biographer, Raymond of Capua, described her starvation in admiring terms, framing it as evidence of her extraordinary holiness. When Catherine died in 1380 at the age of 33, her emaciated body was treated as a sacred relic. Modern historians have a term for this. They call it holy anorexia. The scholar Rudolf Bell studied hundreds of cases of Italian holy women from the 13th through the 16th centuries and found a striking pattern. Women who starved themselves were disproportionately likely to be canonized. The Church didn't just tolerate extreme fasting among its female saints, it rewarded it. The thinner and more self-denying a woman was, the holier she appeared. The body wasting away was proof that the spirit was winning. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Or rather, the people who did say something were usually overruled. Some church authorities expressed concern about extreme fasting, noting that it could be a sign of demonic deception rather than divine grace. But in practice, the women who ate the least were the women who attracted the most followers, the most donations, and the most institutional attention. Starvation was good for business. And behind all of this was a class divide that nobody talked about openly. The fasting rules that the Church imposed applied to everyone, peasant and lord alike. But the experience of those rules was radically different depending on your income. A peasant family scraping by on barley porridge and salted herring didn't need the Church to tell them to eat less. They were already eating less. The fasting calendar simply gave a spiritual gloss to a reality that poverty had already created. Your hunger wasn't deprivation, it was devotion. Meanwhile, the clergy themselves were not exactly wasting away. Monastery records from across medieval Europe show detailed accounts of food purchases that included wine, fresh fish, spiced meats, and imported delicacies. Many monasteries maintained elaborate kitchens and employed dedicated cooks. Bishops and abbots hosted feasts that rivaled those of the nobility. The same institution that told peasants their empty stomachs brought them closer to God was operating some of the best-stocked pantries on the continent. And somehow, it gets worse. Because fasting wasn't just about spiritual discipline or social control, it also became a tool for diagnosing witchcraft. During the witch trial periods of the 15th through 17th centuries, a woman's relationship to food could be used as evidence against her. Eating too much suggested gluttony and demonic influence. Eating too little suggested supernatural sustenance from the devil. Refusing to eat during imprisonment was interpreted as proof that Satan was feeding you invisibly. There was no safe answer. Food had become a trap with theological teeth. For over 1,000 years, the Christian Church turned eating into a moral act with consequences that ranged from public humiliation to sainthood to execution. The body wasn't something you lived in, it was something you battled. And food wasn't nourishment, it was temptation. Everything was in place for dieting to become something entirely different. The medical framework from the Greeks, the moral framework from the Church, the cultural habit of treating hunger as virtue. All of those threads were about to converge in a place nobody expected. Not a monastery or a medical school, a Venetian nobleman's dining room. And the book he wrote there in 1558 would accidentally invent the modern diet. His name was Luigi Cornaro, and by his own account, he was a mess. Born into Venetian aristocracy in the late 1400s, Cornaro spent his 20s and 30s the way most wealthy Italians did at the time, eating lavishly, drinking heavily, and generally treating his body like it existed for entertainment purposes only. By his late 30s, he was chronically ill. His doctors told him, more or less, that he was going to die if he didn't change. So Cornaro did something radical. He cut his daily food intake to exactly 12 ounces of solid food and 14 ounces of wine every day, no exceptions. For the rest of his life, and he lived to be either 98 or 102, depending on which historical record you trust, in the 1500s. When the average life expectancy was somewhere around 40, Cornaro wrote about his experience in a book called Discourses on the Sober Life, published in 1558. And this book matters because it represents a fundamental shift in why people restricted food. Cornaro wasn't fasting for God. He wasn't trying to balance his humors. He wasn't performing discipline for political power. He was doing it because he wanted to live longer and feel better. That's it. The motivation was personal, secular, and entirely self-interested. The version the public knew about dieting was spiritual warfare and ancient medicine. Behind the scenes, Cornaro had quietly replaced both with something new: vanity, self-improvement. The idea that you could engineer your own body through willpower and portion control. His book became a bestseller across Europe, reprinted for over 200 years, and it planted a seed that wouldn't fully bloom for another 3 centuries. The idea that restricting food was something you did for yourself, not for God or your country or your doctor, for you. But the version you've heard about the history of dieting probably skips the next 200 years. And that's a mistake, because those centuries are when the church's grip on daily life loosened enough for a completely different motivation to take its place: beauty. During the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, European beauty standards for women shifted constantly, but one thread held steady. The ideal body was something that required effort to maintain. In the 1600s and 1700s, corsets did most of that work mechanically, squeezing the torso into fashionable shapes regardless of what was underneath. But by the late 1700s and early 1800s, fashion was changing. Dresses became thinner, fabrics became lighter, silhouettes became more revealing. And suddenly, the body underneath the clothing mattered in a way it hadn't before. Enter George Gordon, better known as Lord Byron, the most famous poet in the English-speaking world in the early 1800s. Also, by modern standards, one of the first celebrity crash dieters in recorded history. Byron was terrified of getting fat. He weighed himself obsessively, sometimes multiple times a day. His preferred diet consisted of thin biscuits soaked in vinegar, soda water, and the occasional potato drenched in more vinegar. When he felt he'd eaten too much, he wore multiple layers of heavy wool clothing while exercising to sweat off the weight. He took laxatives regularly. He chewed tobacco to suppress his appetite. His friend Thomas More described him as living in constant war with his own body. And here's the part that matters. Byron's thinness wasn't just personal vanity. It became fashionable. Young women across England began imitating his diet. Drinking vinegar to stay slim became a trend directly traceable to Byron's influence. Medical journals from the 1820s include references to women making themselves ill by following what they understood to be Byron's eating habits. A poet's eating disorder became a continent-wide beauty standard. That's the kind of detail that makes you stop and reconsider what diet culture actually is. It wasn't invented by Instagram influencers or fitness magazines. It was invented by a romantic poet with a vinegar habit in 1815. And this is where things get genuinely commercial. Because the next figure in this story didn't just diet, he sold it. William Banting was a London undertaker, short, overweight by the standards of the 1850s, and increasingly frustrated that nothing he tried seemed to help. He consulted multiple doctors. He tried swimming, rowing, walking, even a spa in Turkey. Nothing worked. Then, in 1862, Banting went to see an ear, nose, and throat surgeon named William Harvey, not for his weight, for his hearing. Harvey had been reading the work of a French physiologist named Claude Bernard, who had recently discovered connections between diet and diabetes. Harvey put Banting on an experimental eating plan that eliminated sugar, starch, beer, and potatoes, essentially a proto-low-carb diet. Banting lost roughly 50 pounds in under a year, and then he did something that nobody in the history of weight loss had done before, on this scale. He wrote a pamphlet about it and sold it to the public. Letter on Corpulence, addressed to the public, was published in 1863. It cost sixpence. It was written in plain, conversational English, not medical Latin. And it went viral, or whatever the 1860s equivalent of viral was. The pamphlet sold so many copies that banting became a common English verb meaning to diet. In Sweden, the word banter still means to diet today, over 160 years later. People thought they had the full picture of dieting at this point. A medical curiosity, a religious obligation, maybe an occasional fad. They were wrong. Banting's pamphlet didn't just make dieting popular, it made dieting a product. Something you could package, sell, and market to the general public. The diet industry didn't begin in the 20th century. It began in an undertaker's pamphlet in 1863. And riding alongside Banting's pamphlet was a piece of technology that would reshape the entire relationship between human beings and their bodies. The bathroom scale. Scales had existed in various forms for centuries, but they were tools of commerce, used to weigh goods in markets and shops. The idea of routinely weighing your own body was, for most of human history, absurd. You knew your body by how your clothes fit, how you felt, how you moved. Weight was a sensation, not a number. That changed in the late 1800s. Coin-operated weighing machines began appearing in public spaces across Europe and America, in pharmacies, train stations, and department stores. For a penny, you could step on a platform and receive a printed card with your exact weight. And for the first time, millions of ordinary people began to think of their bodies in numerical terms. Not, "I feel heavy," but "I weigh 172 pounds. The bathroom scale turned the body into data. And once the body was data, it could be measured, tracked, compared, and judged against an external standard. The question was no longer, "Do I feel healthy?" It was, "Do I weigh the right amount?" And the answer to that question was about to be defined not by doctors or philosophers or priests, but by the least likely authority imaginable: insurance companies. Between 1890 and 1925, the Western world compressed more innovation in dieting than the previous 3,000 years combined. New science, new products, new moral frameworks, and new industries all arrived within a single generation. And the clock was ticking on how long anyone could keep up. It starts with a chemist named Wilbur Olin Atwater. In the 1890s, working out of a laboratory at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, Atwater built a device called a respiration calorimeter. It was essentially a sealed chamber large enough to hold a person, equipped with instruments that could measure exactly how much energy the human body burned and exactly how much energy different foods contained. He measured that energy in a unit borrowed from physics, the calorie. Atwater didn't invent the calorie. That credit goes to Nicolas Clement, a French physicist who defined it in 1824 as the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. But Atwater was the first person to systematically apply it to food. He tested hundreds of ingredients, publishing detailed tables showing how many calories were in a gram of protein, a gram of fat, a gram of carbohydrate. His numbers: 4 calories per gram of protein, 4 per gram of carbohydrate, 9 per gram of fat, are still the standard used on nutrition labels today, over 130 years later. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that followed. Atwater's work turned food into math. Before his calorie tables, food was cultural, spiritual, sensory, emotional. After his calorie tables, food was arithmetic. You could add it up, you could budget it, you could fail at it. And failure could be expressed in a precise number of units. The calorie gave the diet industry something it had never had before: a scoreboard. And almost immediately, someone figured out how to sell it. In 1918, a Los Angeles physician named Lulu Hunt Peters published a book called Diet and Health, with Key to the Calories. The premise was simple: count your calories, eat fewer than you burn, lose weight. Peters wrote in a chatty, accessible style aimed directly at women, and she framed calorie counting as a patriotic duty during World War I, arguing that women who ate less were freeing up food for soldiers overseas. The book sold over 2 million copies. It remained in print for decades, and it established the basic template that the diet industry would follow for the next century. Take a scientific concept, simplify it into a rule, aim it at women, and wrap it in moral language. Peters didn't just teach calorie counting, she taught guilt. "How anyone can want to be anything but thin is beyond my comprehension," she wrote. Which, looking back, was either incredibly honest or incredibly revealing about what the diet industry was actually selling. While Peters was counting calories in Los Angeles, something stranger was happening in Battle Creek, Michigan. John Harvey Kellogg, a Seventh-day Adventist physician, was running the Battle Creek Sanitarium. a health resort that attracted thousands of patients a year, including presidents and industrialists. Kellogg believed that most disease originated in the gut, and his prescribed cure was a combination of extreme dietary restriction, aggressive exercise, and daily enemas. His emphasis on bland, unstimulating foods led him to invent cornflakes, and his brother Will Keith Kellogg turned the cereal concept into a commercial empire, founding the Kellogg Company in 1906. A product originally designed to suppress appetite became one of the most consumed breakfast foods on Earth, and it quietly shaped how Americans thought about what a healthy morning meal looked like for the next century. Now, the 1920s accelerated everything. The flapper era brought a dramatic shift in women's fashion. Hemlines rose, corsets disappeared, drop-waist dresses hung straight from the shoulders, and the ideal silhouette was flat-chested, narrow-hipped, and thin. For the first time in Western fashion history, the dominant beauty standard for women required being genuinely slender, not just corseted into shape. And the diet industry responded with its most cynical move yet. In 1928, the American Tobacco Company launched one of the most successful advertising campaigns of the 20th century. The slogan was simple: reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet. The campaign explicitly marketed Lucky Strike cigarettes as a weight loss tool. Advertisements showed slender women with the shadow of a double chin looming behind them, implying that a cigarette was the only thing standing between them and obesity. The campaign was designed by Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, and the man widely considered the father of public relations. It worked. Lucky Strike sales jumped over 300%. Women across America started smoking specifically to stay thin. A tobacco company had successfully positioned a carcinogen as a diet product, and millions of people bought it. Literally. And then came the final piece, the piece that built the framework we still live inside today. In the 1940s, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company published its first set of ideal weight tables. These were charts that listed, for every height, the weight range that correlated with the lowest mortality rates among the company's policyholders. If you weighed more than your designated range, you were officially overweight. These tables weren't created by nutritionists or physicians or public health researchers. They were created by actuaries. Their purpose wasn't to make people healthier, it was to determine who to charge higher premiums. Metropolitan Life needed a way to quantify risk, and body weight was easy to measure. So they drew lines on a chart and called everything above the line a medical problem. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you. When those tables were first published, the American obesity rate was a fraction of what it is today. The category of overweight was created not in response to a health crisis, but in response to an insurance company's need to sort people into risk categories. The disease was named before the epidemic existed. The diet industry had its target market defined for it by an actuarial table in a Manhattan office building. By 1950, the infrastructure was complete. Calories gave you the math, bathroom scales gave you the daily measurement, insurance tables gave you the target number, advertising gave you the fear, and a century of moral conditioning, from monks to flappers, gave you the guilt when you missed the mark. The entire apparatus of modern diet culture was fully operational before the obesity epidemic had even begun. So where does that leave us? 2,400 years. And at no point in that entire timeline was dieting primarily about health. It was about discipline in Athens, loyalty in Sparta, power in Rome, salvation in the medieval church, vanity in the Renaissance, commerce in the Victorian era, and corporate risk assessment in the 20th century. The reason changed every few centuries. The behavior never did. People restricted food, felt virtuous for doing it, judged others who didn't, and called it progress. The obesity epidemic, the thing most people assume invented dieting, didn't become a recognized public health concern until the 1980s and 90s. By that point, calorie counting was already 70 years old. The bathroom scale had been a household fixture for half a century. Weight Watchers had been operating since 1963. Slim Fast hit shelves in 1977. The diet industry didn't grow in response to obesity. Obesity arrived in a world where the diet industry was already waiting for it, fully built, fully funded, and looking for customers. That's not a conspiracy, it's just history. And it's the kind of history that changes how you look at the next diet ad that crosses your screen. The language of control, guilt, discipline, and moral failure that gets attached to eating didn't come from medical research. It came from monks and senators and poets and insurance adjusters, layered over centuries until it felt like common sense. The real question isn't why people diet. People have always found reasons to restrict what they eat, and they always will. The real question is why we keep telling ourselves that this time it's different. That this version of food restriction, unlike every other version across 2.5 millennia, is purely rational, purely scientific, purely about health. Every generation before us believed the same thing about their reasons. Every single one was wrong. If this video changed how you think about something you do every day, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one, histories hiding inside habits that everyone assumes are modern. Click the video on screen for the next one.